The air in the courtroom was thick, suffocating. It smelled of old wood, cheap coffee, and the cloying perfume of my son-in-law's lawyer, Tom Gallagher. My daughter's husband, her widower, sat across from me, the very picture of manufactured grief. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes, fixed on the judge, were artfully moist. He had played his part perfectly for 6 long months, convincing the world he was a broken man. But I saw him. I saw the flicker of triumph in his gaze, the smug tilt of his lips that he couldn't quite suppress. He believed he had won. His lawyer, a shark named Markham, had just concluded his closing argument, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Your Honor, this is a simple matter. Thomas Gallagher is the sole beneficiary of his beloved wife's last will and testament, a will signed in love and devotion. All we ask is that Sarah Reed's final wishes be respected. The lie hung in the air, so foul I could taste it. The judge, a woman with weary eyes, turned her gaze to me. Mrs. Reed, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Do you have any final words? I rose slowly, my joints aching not from age, but from the weight of my fury. I could feel every eye in the room on meth jury, the press, the curious public who had followed this sordid little drama. I didn't look at the judge. My eyes locked onto Tom's. The smugness on his face wavered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Your Honor, I began, my voice clear and cold, echoing in the sudden silence. I have nothing left to say. I paused, letting the statement settle. But my daughter, Sarah, she does. From my handbag, I produced a small, silver USB drive. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger. It seemed so small, so insignificant, but I knew it was a thunderbolt. I walked to the courtroom's main display screen and, with a steady hand, inserted the drive into the port. A file menu appeared. There was only one file. Clicked it. Tom's face went pale. Markham shot to his feet, objecting, but the judge waved him into silence. Her own curiosity piqued. The screen flickered to life. And then, I was back in the suffocating silence of my own home. 6 months earlier, the accident had happened on a Tuesday. The police called it a single-car incident. Sarah's car had gone off the winding coastal road near Marblehead, plunging into the gray, choppy waters of the Atlantic. They said the roads were slick from an autumn drizzle. They said she might have been driving too fast. They ruled it an accident before her body was even cold. But I knew my daughter. Sarah drove that road every week to visit the art gallery that displayed her work. She knew every curve, every dip. She drove her vintage convertible with the careful, deliberate grace she applied to everything in her life. She was not a careless person. And she was terrified of Tom. In the weeks following the funeral, my house in Beacon Hill became a mausoleum. The grandfather clock in the hall was the only sound, its heavy pendulum swinging back and forth, counting out the seconds of my empty life. I would sit for hours in the library, the one room that still felt like it held a piece of her. Her portrait hung above the marble fireplace, painted a year before she met him. In it, her smile was genuine, her eyes bright with a future that had been stolen from her. I remembered the day she brought Tom home. He was handsome. I had to give him that. A dazzling smile, eyes that seemed to drink you in, and a story about a humble upbringing that he'd spun into a successful career in investment banking. He was charming. Too charming. It was the rehearsed charm of a salesman who knows exactly what his customer wants to hear. Sarah was smitten. She saw a soulmate. I saw a predator. My daughter was kind, trusting, and the heiress to a fortune built over 4 generations. Tom was ambitious, hungry, and had the kind of background that made him crave the legitimacy that our name, the Reed name, could provide. He loves me, Mom, she'd insisted one afternoon over tea. Her cheeks flushed. He doesn't care about the money. Then he won't mind signing a prenuptial agreement. I had replied, my voice cooler than I intended. The look of hurt on her face was a physical blow. But I didn't relent. I had spent my life building and protecting my family's legacy after my husband passed. I would not see it handed over to a wolf in a bespoke suit. David Chen, my lawyer and a friend since college, drafted an ironclad document. If they divorced, Tom would walk away with nothing but what he came with. To my surprise, Tom agreed to sign it. He did so with a flourish, smiling at me across David's mahogany desk. Anything to make you feel secure, Evelyn, he'd said, calling me by my first name in a way that was meant to sound familiar but felt like a trespass. All I want is your daughter. At the time, I thought I had one. I thought I had protected her. I was a fool. I had planned for a divorce, a scenario where Sarah would be alive to leave him. I never planned for murder. The prenup had a loophole I never saw. It said nothing about what would happen if my daughter died. A month after the funeral, Tom's lawyer sent the letter. It informed me of a new will Sarah had apparently signed just 4 weeks before her death. It revoked her previous will, the one that left her personal assets in a trust for her future children and charitable causes. This new one left everything: her art collection, her stock portfolio, her trust fund directly and unequivocally to her beloved husband, Thomas Gallagher. He had waited a respectable amount of time, just long enough for the initial shock of her death to fade for the outside world. For me, it would never fade. The letter was a declaration of war. He wasn't just coming for the money. He was trying to erase the daughter I knew, replacing her with a version that would betray everything she believed in. He was spitting on her grave. And then he filed the lawsuit. He sued me, the executor of her estate, to force the validation of his fraudulent will. That was his first mistake. He thought I was just a grieving mother, a fragile old woman who would crumble under legal pressure. He didn't know me at all. Grief doesn't make you weak. It burns away the trivial things, the small fears, the social niceties. It leaves behind a core of pure, cold resolve. He had taken my daughter. I would be damned if I let him have her legacy. The days blurred into a miserable rhythm of meetings with David, reviewing depositions, and staring at the soulless legal documents that reduced my daughter's life to a series of assets. Tom's legal team, led by Markham, began painting a picture of me as a controlling, jealous mother-in-law who had never approved of her daughter's choice of husband. They claimed I was contesting the will out of spite. In a way, they were right. It was spite. It was rage. It was the last act of love I could offer my child. I spent my nights sleeplessly, wandering the silent halls of the house that was once filled with her laughter. I'd run my hands over the spines of her favorite books, touch the keys of the piano she used to play, and stare at her portrait, begging her for a sign, for some way to prove what I knew in my soul to be true. What did he do to you, my love? I'd whisper into the darkness. Help me show them. Help me show them all. One evening, about 2 months into the legal battle, I found myself drawn to her bedroom. I hadn't been inside since the day of the funeral. Her staff had kept it clean, but it was preserved as she'd left it. Perfect. Heartbreaking time capsule. Her scent, a faint mix of lavender and oil paint, still lingered in the air. I sat on the edge of her bed, the silence pressing down on me. My eyes scanned the room, searching for something. Anything. They landed on her bookshelf. It was filled not with novels, but with heavy art books. Volumes on Renaissance painters, Impressionist masters, modern sculptors. Sarah loved the weight of them, the glossy pages filled with beauty. She told me once that when the world felt ugly, she would hide in them. My gaze drifted over the titles. The complete works of Caravaggio, Monet, a retrospective. The lives of the artists. My fingers traced the leather-bound spine of the last one. It was an old, heavy tome, one I'd given her for her 16th birthday. It was slightly out of place, pushed back a fraction of an inch more than the others. On impulse, I pulled it from the shelf. It was heavier than I remembered. I opened the cover, and something slipped out, falling silently onto the plush oriental rug. It wasn't a bookmark. It was small and silver. A USB drive. My breath caught in my throat. Picked it up. My fingers trembling. Felt cold against my skin. A tiny sliver of metal that suddenly felt like the most important object in the world. I didn't know what was on it, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was the sign I had been praying for. It was Sarah, reaching out from beyond the grave. I walked back to the library, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I sat at her antique writing desk, opened my laptop, and with a hand that was surprisingly steady, I inserted the drive. The screen glowed, illuminating my face in the dim light. A single file appeared, labeled with a single word. Mom. I took a deep, shuddering breath and clicked it open. The video player launched, and the screen filled with my daughter's face. She was in her car, parked somewhere I didn't recognize. It was daytime, but the light was weak. She looked pale, exhausted. The bright spark in her eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow fear. Her hands were shaking as she adjusted the phone she was using to record. Mom, she whispered, her voice a strained, ragged thing. Mom, if you're watching this, it means something has happened to me. Her eyes darted nervously towards the rearview mirror, as if she expected to see him appear at any moment. It's Tom. He's not who I thought he was. A tear traced a path down her cheek. He's been threatening me. He found out about the prenup, about how it doesn't cover this. He told me he would rather be a widower than a divorce. She choked on a sob, a sound that ripped through my own chest. He made me sign a new will. He hurt me. Mom, he said if I didn't sign it, if I told anyone. Her voice broke completely. The video wavered as the phone slipped in her trembling hands. She looked directly into the lens, her eyes wide with terror, pleading with me, with a future she was no longer sure she would have. He said he would make it look like an accident. The screen went black, but the recording wasn't over. The video was gone, but the audio continued. I could hear her ragged breathing, the sound of the car door opening, and then, his voice, Tom's voice, not the smooth, charming tone he used for the world, but something else, something cold, and sharp, and full of venom. Who were you talking to? He snarled. No one. Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I was just listening to music. Give me the phone. Tom, please. There was a scuffling sound, a sharp cry of pain from Sarah, and then the audio cut out. I sat there in the darkness of the library, the glow of the laptop screen casting long shadows on the walls. The silence of the house returned, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the truth. It was filled with the echo of my daughter's last, terrified words. The grief in my heart did not lessen, but something else grew alongside it. Something powerful and terrible. An icy rage that burned away my tears. Tom hadn't just taken her life. He had terrorized her. He had beaten her. He had squeezed the very soul out of my beautiful girl before sending her car into the sea. He thought he had committed the perfect crime. He thought he had erased all the evidence. But he had overlooked one thing. He had overlooked a mother's love, and a daughter's last, desperate attempt to be heard. I copied the file onto a new drive, hiding the original back in its place. I did not call David. Not yet. This was too precious. Too explosive. This was not just a key to winning a civil lawsuit. This was the key to his prison cell. One shot. I had one shot to use it, and I had to make it count. He wanted a war. I would give him one. But we wouldn't be fighting on his terms anymore. We would be fighting on mine. And in the end, I would not just take his stolen inheritance. I would take everything else. His freedom. His reputation. His future. I would leave him with nothing but the truth of what he was, for all the world to see. The days that followed my discovery were a study in duality. To the world, and especially to Tom and his legal team, I was a woman on the verge of breaking. I allowed the strain to show in my face. I let my shoulders slump. During depositions, when Markham's questions became particularly cruel, I would let a tear slip, a carefully calculated performance of a grieving mother pushed to her limit. I played the part they expected me to play, but alone. In the quiet of my home, a different woman emerged. I was focused, methodical. The icy rage had not thawed. It had solidified into a weapon. I spent my evenings with David Chan, planning our strategy. The first time I showed him the video, in the sanctity of my library, he sat in stunned silence for a full minute after it ended. The color had drained from his face. David had known Sarah since she was a little girl. He had attended her ballet recitals and her college graduation. He looked at me. His eyes filled with a shared sorrow and a newfound horror. "Evelyn," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "This is more than a probate case. This is evidence in a murder investigation." "I know," I replied, my own voice steady. "But if we go to the police now, Tom will lawyer up. He'll claim the video was faked, that Sarah was unstable. His team will bury this in motions and procedural delays for years. He might even get away with it. We have to be smarter than that." David leaned forward, his hands clasped on my desk. He understood immediately. We let him walk into the trap. We let him build his entire case on the foundation of being a loving, devoted husband. We let him testify under oath. We get him to commit to his lies, in front of a judge and jury. "Exactly," I said. "We make him perjure himself so thoroughly that when this video comes out, he has nowhere left to run." It was a dangerous game. It required a level of patience I wasn't sure I possessed. It meant sitting in court, day after day, listening to the man who murdered my daughter paint himself as a saint and me as a devil. The preliminary hearings began. Tom's team came out swinging. They paraded a series of witnesses, friends of Tom's, distant acquaintances of Sarah Sue, all testified to what a perfect couple they were. They spoke of Tom's adoration for his wife, his constant support of her art, his utter devastation after her death. Each word was a lie, a carefully polished stone laid on the path to his inheritance. Markham was a master of courtroom theater. He'd pace before the jury, his voice ranging from a sympathetic whisper to a roar of righteous indignation. He portrayed Tom as a victim, not just of a tragic accident, but of a vindictive mother-in-law. "Mrs. Reed," he said during his opening statement, gesturing towards me. "A woman who, by her own admission, never liked Tom Gallagher. A woman who forced a prenuptial agreement on this loving couple. A clear sign of her distrust. And now, blinded by her grief and prejudice, she seeks to deny her own daughter's dying wish, trampling on her memory to satisfy her own grudge." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I did not flinch. I met his gaze and held it, letting him see nothing but a tired, sad old woman. Inside, I was memorizing his face, the smug curl of his lip, and I was imagining the moment I would wipe it clean off. Tom's performance on the stand was breathtaking in its audacity. He cried. He actually produced real tears as he described the last morning he saw Sarah alive. "She kissed me goodbye," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She told me she loved me. We were talking about starting a family. We were happy." He looked at the jury, his blue eyes glistening with sincerity. "I don't understand why Evelyn is doing this. The money, it means nothing to me. I would give it all back. Every last cent. Just to have one more day with my Sarah." The courtroom was spellbound. I saw a woman on the jury dabbing her eyes with a tissue. He was winning. And every lie he told, every false tear he shed, was another nail in his own coffin. David would occasionally object. Steady counterpoint to Markham's theatrics. But for the most part, we let them play their hand. We let them build their case higher and higher. During a recess, David leaned over. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," I said. My tone clipped. "I'm just watching a man dig his own grave. I want to make sure it's deep enough." The most difficult part was the character assassination. Markham called our former housekeeper to the stand, a woman I had to let go a year prior for stealing. He must have paid her well. She testified that I was a cold, controlling mother. She spoke of arguments she'd overheard between Sarah and me, arguments that never happened. Mrs. Reed was always telling her who she could and couldn't be friends with, the woman said, looking piously at the judge. She never thought Mr. Gallagher was good enough, just because he didn't come from old money. Lie after lie. My life, my relationship with my daughter, twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. They were trying to create a narrative where it was plausible that Sarah would cut me out of her life, that she would secretly change her will to spite me. And the most painful part was, it was working. The media began to run stories with headlines like "Grieving Husband versus Controlling Mother" and "The Battle for the Reed Fortune." I became a caricature, a villain in the story of my own daughter's death. One evening, after a particularly brutal day in court where Markham had implied I drove Sarah into Tom's arms with my overbearing nature, I nearly broke. I came home to the empty house, the silence screaming at me. I walked into the library and stood before Sarah's portrait. Her painted eyes seemed to hold a question I couldn't answer. "Am I doing the right thing?" I whispered to her. "I have to listen to them destroy our memory. Destroy you. Destroy me. I have to sit there and let them lie." The weight of it all pressed down on me, and for the first time in months, I felt my resolve crack. I sank into the leather armchair beneath her portrait and finally allowed myself to weep. I cried for my daughter. I cried for the beautiful relationship they were soiling in a public courtroom. And I cried out of sheer, helpless rage at the injustice of it all. My phone rang. It was David. "Don't read the news tonight, Evelyn," he said, his voice kind. "It's too late," I managed to say, my voice thick. "David, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can sit there for one more day and listen to it." "Yes, you can," he said firmly. "Listen to me. Today, Markham made Tom testify, under oath, that his marriage to Sarah was perfect. He made him swear that they never had a serious argument. Not once. He asked him, point blank, "Mr. Gallagher, did you ever, in any way, threaten or coerce your wife?" And Tom looked the jury in the eye and said, "Never. I loved her more than life itself." He's locked in, Evelyn. He's built his prison and thrown away the key. All we have to do is wait for the right moment to lock the door. His words were like a splash of cold water. He was right. This pain, this humiliation, it was all part of the price. It was the cost of justice. I took a deep breath, straightened my back, and the weeping stopped. The ice was reforming in my veins, harder and colder than before. "You're right, David," I said. "Thank you. Get some rest, Evelyn. The final phase is about to begin." We let Tom's team present their entire case. We let them call their last witness. We watched them submit the fraudulent will into evidence, along with a forged note from a handwriting expert they paid off. They rested their case with an air of absolute confidence. They believed they had systematically dismantled my credibility and proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the will was valid. Markham sat down next to Tom, clapping him on the back with a triumphant grin. Tom looked over at me. And for the first time, he dropped the grieving husband act entirely. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible smirk. A look that said, "I told you I'd win. You're just a bitter old woman. And I have beaten you." It was the look that sealed his fate. He had grown arrogant. He had grown careless. He believed his own lies. He thought the game was over. He had no idea it was just about to begin. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the library, holding the original USB drive in my hand. It was warm from my touch. It felt like my daughter's hand in mine. One last time. I was not afraid anymore. I was not sad. I was simply a conduit for her truth. The next morning, I dressed with purpose. I chose a simple, dark gray suit. No jewelry except for my wedding band and a small locket Sarah had given me, which I wore tucked beneath my blouse. When David and I arrived at the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation. It was the day of the closing arguments. The end. We took our seats. David gave my hand a reassuring squeeze under the table. I nodded, my face a calm, placid mask. Markham delivered his closing argument first. Final, grand performance of his client's supposed virtue and my alleged villainy. He ended by holding up a picture of Tom and Sarah on their wedding day. "Don't let this tragedy be compounded by another," he boomed, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Honor this beautiful woman's memory. Honor her love. Honor her last will and testament." He sat down to a hushed courtroom. The judge looked at David. "Mr. Chin." David stood. "Your Honor," he said calmly. "The defense has no closing argument at this time. However, my client, Mrs. Reed, would like to address the court." A murmur went through the room. This was highly unorthodox. Markham jumped to his feet to object. But the judge, her curiosity overriding procedure, looked at me. "Mrs. Reed, do you have something to add?" I rose to my feet. My heart a steady, rhythmic drum. "I do, Your Honor." I walked past the lawyers' tables, my gaze fixed on Tom. His smirk had been replaced by a look of wary confusion. He didn't know what was happening. He had lost control of the narrative, and it terrified him. This was it. The moment we had been waiting for. The moment I had endured hell for. I reached the podium, looked from the judge to the jury, and then, finally, back to the man who murdered my daughter. "Thuaquitoa," I began, my voice ringing with a strength no one in that room had heard from me before. "I have no final words. But my daughter, Sarah, she does." My hand was steady as I inserted the USB drive. The click it made as it seeded into the port was the only sound in the cavernous courtroom. It was a sound as final as a chambered bullet. On the large screen, a file folder appeared. I used the mouse to click it open. The video file, named Mom, stared back at us all. Another click. The screen went black for a second, and then there she was. My daughter. It was not the smiling, vibrant Sarah from the portrait in my library. This was a different person. Her face, projected 10 feet high for the entire room to see, was pale and drawn. Dark circles hung under her eyes like bruises. She was parked in her car, the weak afternoon light filtering through the windshield, catching the tremor in her hands. The sight of her, so full of fear, sent a fresh wave of grief and rage through me. I held onto the podium to steady myself, my knuckles turning white. "Mom," her recorded voice whispered, a fragile sound that nonetheless filled the silent room. A juror in the front row flinched, as if Sarah had spoken directly to her. "Mom, if you're watching this, it means something has happened to me." Tom, who had been half risen from his chair, froze. His carefully constructed mask of sorrow began to crack, the first hairline fractures appearing around his eyes and mouth. Markham was on his feet, buttering. "Objection. Your Honor. This is inadmissible." It's unverified. Prejudicial. The judge didn't even look at him. Her eyes were glued to the screen. Sit down. Mr. Markham, she commanded, her voice low and dangerous. I want to see this. On the screen, my daughter's eyes darted nervously. It's Tom, she continued, her voice breaking. He's not who I thought he was. I could feel Tom's stare burning into the side of my head, but I refused to look at him. I watched my daughter. I owed her that much. He's been threatening me, she sobbed. He found out about the prenup. He told me he would rather be a widower than a divorce. He made me sign a new will. He hurt me. Mom. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The jury was no longer a panel of impartial observers. They were transfixed, their faces a mixture of horror and pity. The woman who had been crying for Tom earlier now stared at him with wide, accusing eyes. Sarah's face filled the screen, her terror a palpable thing. He said if I didn't sign it, if I told anyone, he said he would make it look like an accident. The video ended. The screen went black. But the sound of her last words hung in the air. An indictment more powerful than any legal argument. The silence that followed was absolute. Profound. It was the silence of a truth so terrible it stole the breath from every person in the room. Then, the chaos erupted. It's a lie. Tom screamed, leaping to his feet. His face was a contorted mask of fury and panic. The charming, grief-stricken widower was gone, replaced by the monster from my daughter's video. She was unstable. Evelyn poisoned her mind against me. This is a fake. She faked it all. Markham rushed to his client's side, trying to restrain him, his own face ashen. The judge began banging her gavel, her voice sharp. Order. Mr. Gallagher. Control yourself or I will have you removed. David Chun stood slowly, his calm a stark contrast to the pandemonium. He waited for the judge's gavel to quiet the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and deliberate. Your Honor, he said, addressing the judge but letting his words fall upon the jury. My client did not fake this video. And she did not poison her daughter's mind. Thomas Gallagher did that all by himself. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. And what you just saw is not the only evidence found on that drive. Tom stopped struggling against Markham. A new kind of fear entered his eyes. Pure, primal terror. The video file was cut short. David explained. But the audio recording continued for another 37 seconds. We have had it authenticated by 3 independent forensic experts. With the court's permission, I would like to play that audio now. Objection. Markham shouted, his voice strained. This is an ambush. We have not had time to review this supposed evidence. Overruled. The judge snapped, her patience gone. Her eyes were fixed on Tom, a new hardness in her gaze. The witness, Mr. Gallagher, testified under oath that his marriage was perfect. He swore he never threatened his wife. This evidence speaks directly to that testimony. Proceed, Mr. Chin. David nodded to me. I clicked on the second file, the audio track. First, there was only the sound of Sarah's ragged, terrified breathing. Then, the distinct sound of a car door opening. And then, his voice. It was Tom's voice, but stripped of all its warmth and charm. It was a cold, venomous snarl. Who were you talking to? The jury leaned forward in their seats. Sarah's recorded voice was a tiny, frightened whisper. No one. I was just listening to music. Give me the phone. The voice on the recording demanded. Tom, please. The next sound was a sickening shuffle, a thud, and then a sharp, piercing cry of pain from Sarah. It was a sound that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. It was the sound of my child being hurt. In the courtroom, Several people gasped audibly. And then Tom's voice again. No longer a snarl, but a low, menacing growl, filled with a chilling hatred. You try anything like that again, Sarah, and I swear to God, that drive off the Marblehead cliff will look like a Sunday cruise. Do you understand me? A muffled sob was the only reply. Then, silence. The recording ended. I clicked the file closed. The screen went dark again, leaving us all in the heavy, poisoned silence of the courtroom. No one moved. No one breathed. The 37 seconds of audio had done more to destroy Tom Gallagher than 6 months of legal proceedings. It had allowed the world to hear the monster behind the mask. Tom stood frozen, his face the color of ash. He stared at the blank screen as if he could still hear his own damning words echoing in the chamber. He looked at the jury, at their faces of stone-cold disgust. He looked at the judge, whose expression was one of pure contempt. He was trapped. He was exposed. And in that moment, he completely and utterly shattered. No! He roared. A guttural, animalistic sound of pure desperation. He shoved Markham aside, sending him stumbling into the defense table. She was a manipulative liar. She was crazy. She drove me to it. She deserved it. She deserved everything she got. The confession, screamed in a fit of rage, was the final, self-inflicted blow. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled for the doors. The court officer moved towards Tom, his hand on his weapon. The judge's gavel came down like thunderclaps. Again and again. Order! Order in this court. Officer! Restrain Mr. Gallagher. This hearing is in recess. Clear the courtroom. Now. 2 officers converged on Tom, who was now babbling incoherently, his eyes wild. They pulled his arms behind his back. As they led him away, his head swiveled, and his wild eyes found mine. The hatred in them was terrifying. But I didn't look away. I let him see me. I let him see that his perfect plan had been undone by the woman he had dismissed as a weak, old fool. He had underestimated me. He had underestimated my daughter. David put a steadying hand on my arm as the courtroom emptied around us in a flurry of noise and motion. My legs felt weak, my entire body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. The first part of my plan had worked. It had worked more brutally and effectively than I could have ever imagined. Tom had not just been exposed. He had convicted himself with his own mouth. But I knew this was far from over. Markham was a snake. And a cornered snake is the most dangerous. The recess would give them time to regroup, to concoct a new set of lies. They would claim Tom's outburst was the result of emotional distress, a momentary lapse under extreme provocation. They would fight to have the evidence thrown out. And they still didn't know about the final piece of the puzzle. They still believed that if they could somehow discredit the video and the audio, the fraudulent will was still their ticket to a fortune. They were fighting a battle over money. They had no idea that I had already moved the battlefield. As I sat back down in my chair in the now empty courtroom, the silence felt different. It was no longer oppressive. It was calm. It was the quiet after the storm. The storm had broken, and Tom Gallagher was wrecked in its wake. But there was still the wreckage to sort through. And I had one final, devastating surprise waiting for him in the debris. The recess lasted for 2 hours, but it felt like an eternity. David and I were secluded in a small conference room, the silence broken only by the ticking of a wall clock and the distant sound of phones ringing in the courthouse corridors. I drank a cup of black coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to calm the tremor in my hands. The climax in the courtroom had been explosive, but now came the fallout. They'll file for a mistrial, David said, pacing the small room. Markham will argue that the jury is irrevocably prejudiced. He'll claim we ambushed them with evidence they had no chance to review. Will he get it? I asked, my voice flat. David stopped pacing and looked at me. Under normal circumstances, possibly. But these aren't normal circumstances. The judge heard the same thing the jury did. She heard Tom's confession. And his outburst wasn't a product of our ambush. It was a product of his own guilt. She won't grant it. But he has to try. It's his only move. It's not his only move. I corrected him. His only move is to lie more. To double down. He'll say Sarah provoked him. He'll try to smear her name even further. David nodded grimly. He will. Which is why the will is so important. It's her voice. Her final, sane, deliberate voice. It's the one thing that will silence all of his noise for good. When we were finally called back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The public gallery was packed, buzzing with a frenzied energy. The press section was overflowing. The jury members were led back in. And I watched their faces. They refused to even look at the defense table. Their expressions a uniform mask of revulsion. Tom was already seated. He was flanked by Markham and another lawyer from his firm. He looked smaller. Diminished. The rage had subsided, replaced by a sullen, resentful pallor. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he stared straight ahead, refusing to meet my gaze. He looked like a cornered rat, stripped of his bravado and left with nothing but his own venom. As David predicted, Markham immediately stood and moved for a mistrial. He argued passionately, his voice filled with outrage. He accused us of prosecutorial misconduct in a civil case, of trial by theater. He claimed the audio was taken out of context, that Tom's outburst was an understandable reaction from a grieving man being slandered from beyond the grave. The judge listened, her face impassive. When he was finished, she didn't hesitate. "Mr. Markham," she said, her voice like ice. "Your client perjured himself on the stand. He was confronted with evidence of that perjury. His subsequent outburst was his own doing. Motion for a mistrial is denied. Do you have anything further to present in this case regarding the will of Sarah Reed?" Markham's face tightened. This was it. The moment of truth. He had lost control of the narrative completely. His only remaining play was to cling to the piece of paper that started this all. "Yes, Your Honor. Despite the unfortunate theatrics of the plaintiff, the fact remains that we have a legally executed will. A will signed by Sarah Reed, witness, and authenticated. That is the only matter before this court. We ask that you rule on the validity of that document." He was retreating to the last defensible bit of ground he had. He thought it was solid. He was about to find out it was quicksand. David stood. "Your Honor, Mr. Markham is correct. The matter before this court is, and always has been, the true last will and testament of Sarah Reed." He paused, letting the room hang on his words. "And we agree that the court should rule on that matter. In fact, we would like to introduce a document into evidence to assist the court in its ruling." He walked to the clerk and handed over a sealed, notarized envelope. "This," David announced, his voice ringing with authority, "is the actual final will of Sarah Reed." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Tom's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Markham stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "Objection!" he cried out, his voice cracking. "This is absurd. We have the will. It's been submitted. What is this nonsense?" "It's not nonsense, Mr. Markham," David replied calmly. "It's called a subsequent testament, a will that revokes all previous wills. And this one," he added, looking directly at Tom, "was signed, witnessed, and notarized on October 12th, one full day after your client coerced a terrified woman into signing his fraudulent document." The clerk handed the document to the judge. She broke the seal and began to read. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the rustle of the paper in her hands. I watched Tom, I watched the last vestiges of color drain from his face. He was finally beginning to understand the depth of his miscalculation. He hadn't just been caught in a lie. He had been outmaneuvered from the very beginning. My daughter, in her last days, had been braver and smarter than he had ever given her credit for. The judge continued to read, her expression unreadable. She read the document once, and then she read it again, more slowly this time. Finally, she looked up, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom before landing squarely on Tom. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice now devoid of all emotion. "Would you please read the relevant dispositive provisions of this document for the court?" "With pleasure, Your Honor," David said. He was handed a copy, and he put on his reading glasses. He didn't need them. I knew he had memorized every word. He cleared his throat. "I, Sarah Reed, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking any and all other wills and codicils previously made by me." David's voice was clear and steady. "First, I direct that all my debts and funeral expenses be paid from my estate as soon as is practicable after my death." He paused. "Second, I hereby nullify and make void the document I was forced to sign under duress on October 11th of this year. Does not, and has never, represented my true wishes." He looked up from the page, directly at Tom. "Third, as for my husband, Thomas Gallagher." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. David continued reading. "For his profound betrayal and cruelty, which have caused me unimaginable pain and fear, I leave him the sum of $1, a single dollar, to represent the true and final value I place upon his character." A wave of shocked murmurs and stifled laughter swept through the gallery. The judge banged her gavel once for silence, but her lips were pressed into a thin, tight line, suppressing a smile. Tom looked like he had been physically struck. $1. All his scheming, his lies, his violence, his murder, all for one single, insulting dollar. It wasn't just a disinheritance. It was a final, perfectly crafted act of defiance. It was Sarah, having the last laugh. But she wasn't done. "There's more, Your Honor," David said, his voice ringing with pride. He continued reading from her will. "Fourth, all the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate, both real and personal, of whatsoever kind and wheresoever situated, I give, devise, and bequeath to a new charitable foundation to be established in my name, the Sarah Reed Foundation. The sole purpose of this foundation," he read, his voice growing stronger with every word, "will be to provide shelter, legal aid, and counseling to victims of domestic violence, so that other women may find the safety and escape that I could not. It is my final wish that my life, which was filled with so much privilege, will, in my death, serve those who have been left with nothing." By the time he finished, there was a profound silence in the courtroom. No one was laughing now. The cleverness of the $1 bequest was overshadowed by the sheer grace and power of her final act. She had not only disarmed her killer, but she had also transformed her personal tragedy into a legacy of hope for countless others. She had taken his ugliness and created something beautiful from it. I finally looked at Tom. He was staring into space, his face a blank mask of utter devastation. He had lost. He had lost everything. The money, the status, the future he had killed for. It had all vanished, turned to dust by the last words of the woman he thought he had silenced forever. The judge laid the will down on her bench. "In light of this new and authenticated will," she declared, her voice booming with finality, "the court finds the document submitted by Mr. Gallagher to be null and void. The court recognizes the will dated October 12th as the true and final testament of Sarah Reed. This case is hereby dismissed." She banged the gavel. It was the sound of a coffin lid slamming shut. But as the officers who had been standing by the door started to walk towards the defense table, I knew it wasn't over. This courtroom victory was just the beginning. As they reached Tom, one of them, a detective in a plain suit I hadn't noticed before, leaned down and spoke quietly in his ear. Tom didn't react. He just continued to stare into nothingness. Markham, white-faced and trembling with rage, turned to me as he packed his briefcase. "You," he hissed, his voice low and full of venom. "You enjoyed that, didn't you?" I looked at him, my face calm. "No, Mr. Markham," I said, my voice clear and cold. "I did not enjoy it. But I am satisfied. My daughter has received her justice." "This isn't justice," he spat. "This was a circus." "No," I replied, standing to leave. "The circus is just beginning for your client." As I turned to walk away, I saw them pull Tom to his feet. The detective showed him a warrant, and then, with a quiet click that echoed louder than any gavel, they fastened a pair of handcuffs around his wrists. He was no longer a charismatic millionaire. He was just a common criminal, facing a charge of murder. Walking out of that courtroom was like surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. The air in the hallway felt fresh, clean. The oppressive weight that had been crushing my chest for 6 months had finally begun to lift. Reporters swarmed us, a chaotic frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted questions. "Mrs. Reed, what's your reaction to the verdict?" "Evelyn, did you know about the second will all along? What will happen to Tom Gallagher now?" David shielded me, his hand on my elbow, guiding me through the throng. "No comments at this time," he repeated, his voice a calm, steady barrier against the noise. We pushed through the crowd and out the heavy courthouse doors into the crisp Boston air. For a moment, I was blinded by the daylight. It felt like I hadn't truly seen the sun in half a year. We didn't speak on the drive back to Beacon Hill. There was nothing left to say. The legal battle was over. The truth was out. Sarah's name had been cleared, and her legacy secured. I had done what I set out to do. I had won. But the victory felt hollow. The silence in the car filled with the ghost of the person who should have been there to share it. Back in my library, I poured 2 glasses of sherry, my hand still not entirely steady. I handed one to David. He had been more than a lawyer. He had been my rock, my confidant, the only person who had believed me when the rest of the world saw only a bitter, grieving mother. "To Sarah," he said, raising his glass. "She would be so proud of you, Evelyn." I took a sip. The sweet, warming liquid a stark contrast to the ice that had filled my veins for so long. She was the brave one, David. To have the clarity of mind, in the midst of all that fear, to write that will, to create that foundation. She saved herself. I just delivered the message. We sat in comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The battle was won, but the war for my own peace was just beginning. Tom was in custody, his life effectively over, but Sarah was still gone. Justice, I was learning, was not a cure for grief. It was just an anesthetic. The next few days were a blur of headlines and legal formalities. Tom Gallagher's fall from grace was spectacular and swift. The story was on every news channel, the front page of every paper. The audio of his threats was played on a loop. His courtroom confession dissected by an army of talking heads. He was denied bail. His public image shattered so completely that not even a lawyer of Markham's caliber could put the pieces back together. Markham, in fact, promptly filed a motion to be removed as counsel, citing irreconcilable differences. Tom was toxic, and his former allies were abandoning the sinking ship. My life, on the other hand, was suddenly filled with an outpouring of public support. I received letters, flowers, Messages from strangers who had been moved by Sarah's story. People I hadn't heard from in years called to offer their condolences and their congratulations. I was no longer the villain. I was the avenging mother. A symbol of quiet strength and maternal devotion. The role was uncomfortable. A suit of armor I had no desire to wear. The most difficult part was starting the work of the Sarah Reed Foundation. It was her last wish. Her true legacy. And I was determined to honor it. David and I began the process of establishing the board, securing a location, and drafting the mission statement. Every document I signed, every decision I made, was a painful reminder that this incredible force for good was born from the ugliest of tragedies. I was building her future, a future she would never see. One afternoon, about a week after the trial, I was in Sarah's old studio at the back of the house. It was a beautiful, light-filled room that I had kept locked since her death. Now, I forced myself to go inside. Her unfinished canvases stood on their easels, ghosts of paintings that would never be. The smell of turpentine and oil paint hung in the air, a scent that for me was the very essence of my daughter. I was sorting through a stack of her sketchbooks when I found it. Tucked into the back pocket of a leather-bound book was a letter. The envelope simply said, "Mom." My breath caught. It was her handwriting. This was not a legal document or a terrified video. This was a letter. I sank into her paint-splattered armchair, my heart pounding, and carefully opened the seal. The letter was dated October 13th, the day after she had written her final will, and what must have been just a few days before her death. "Dearest Mom," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means that I found the courage to give it to you, or that you found it after I was gone. I hope, with all my heart. It's the first. But I'm afraid. I'm so afraid. I know you never trusted Tom. I know you saw something in him that my love made me blind to. You were right. You were right about all of it. I'm so sorry I didn't listen. I'm sorry for the pain I must have caused you. For the arguments we had. I wanted so badly to prove you wrong. To show you that my love could make him a better man. But it didn't. It just made me a target. The last few months have been a nightmare. The man I married disappeared. And a monster took his place. He talks about money constantly. Your money. The Reed legacy. He sees it as his right. His prize for having to put up with me. He said that. He actually said that to my face. The cruelty is the worst part. It's in his eyes. A coldness I never saw before. I know what he's planning. I hear it in the way he talks about the future, his future. I'm not in it. I wrote the new will. I saw Mr. Abernathy, the notary you always used. I told him I was afraid. And he helped me date and seal it properly. I wanted to create something good out of all this ugliness. The foundation. It's the only thing that makes me feel like my life will have meant something beyond this horror. But I need you to know. Mom, my real legacy isn't the foundation. It isn't the money. It's you. It's the love you gave me. The strength you taught me to have. It's the strength I'm trying so hard to find right now. I keep thinking about what you would do. You wouldn't let him win. You would fight. And I'm trying to fight. The video. The will. It's my only way. Whatever happens, please don't let this destroy you. Don't let him take you from the world. 2. Live for both of us. Keep painting. Go to Paris in the spring like you always talked about. Don't let my memory be a house full of shadows. Let it be a reason to open the windows. I love you more than words can say. You are the best mother a girl could have ever asked for. You are my hero. Forever yours, Sarah. The tears I had held back for so long finally came. Not tears of rage or grief, but of a profound, heartbreaking love. The letter was a gift. It was her absolution. Her final embrace. She wasn't angry with me. She understood. She had been fighting back. Using the tools of intelligence and foresight that I had tried to instill in her. She had been my daughter to the very end. I held the letter to my chest. the paper crinkling against my blouse. For the first time since her death, I didn't feel the crushing weight of failure. I had not failed to raise a strong woman. I had simply failed to protect her from a monster she had been tricked into loving. The letter changed everything. It was no longer enough to just bring Tom to justice. I had to fulfill her last wish. I had to live. The criminal trial against Tom Gallagher was set for the following spring. The prosecution had an airtight case. They had the video, the audio, the motive, and his own courtroom confession. They had found evidence that he had tampered with the brake lines on Sarah's car, a subtle sabotage that wouldn't cause immediate failure, but would make the car unreliable on a winding, wet road. It was premeditated, cold-blooded murder. I knew I would have to testify. I would have to get on the stand and relive the entire nightmare one more time. I would have to face him again. But the thought no longer terrified me. Sarah's letter was my shield. Her love was my armor. As the winter months settled over Boston, covering the city in a blanket of clean, white snow, I began to work. I threw myself into the foundation, meeting with architects to design a new women's shelter, interviewing potential directors, and setting up the financial framework. The work was demanding, but it was meaningful. With every step forward, I felt like I was pushing back against the darkness that had taken my daughter. I was building a fortress in her name, and I started to paint again. I had packed away my own canvases years ago, after my husband died, focusing instead on running the family business. But now, I felt a pull back to the studio. I set up an easel next to Sarah's, and I began to paint. First, my hands were stiff, my strokes clumsy, but slowly, the colors began to flow. I didn't paint the darkness, the grief. I painted the light. I painted the view of the Charles River from my window. I painted the memory of Sarah's smile. I painted the future she wanted for me. I was opening the windows, just like she had asked. The shadows were still there, lurking in the corners. They would always be there. But they no longer owned the house. They no longer owned me. Spring arrived in Boston, not with a gentle unfurling, but in a sudden, defiant burst of life. The magnolias on Commonwealth Avenue exploded in shades of pink and white, and the city seemed to shake off the gray chill of winter overnight. The changing of the season mirrored the change within me. The ice of my grief had not melted, but life was beginning to grow around its edges once more. The criminal trial was the final shadow I had to step through. Tom's new legal team, pair of slick, court-appointed defense attorneys, knew they couldn't argue his innocence. The evidence was too overwhelming. Their strategy shifted from exoneration to mitigation. They were no longer trying to free him. They were trying to save him from a life sentence without parole. Their new narrative was as insidious as it was predictable. They planned to paint Sarah as a mentally unstable, manipulative woman who had driven Tom to a crime of passion. They would argue that months of emotional abuse had caused him to snap. They would use her history of seeing a therapist for anxiety, something she did to cope with his escalating aggression, as proof of her fragility. They were going to put my dead daughter on trial. When the prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Elena Rios, informed me of their strategy, I felt the old, cold rage stir within me. "They will not," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "They will not tarnish her memory to save that monster. They will try." "Evelyn," Rios said, her expression sympathetic but firm, "it's all they have. They will come after you on the stand, too. They'll portray you as the source of the marriage's problems, the domineering mother-in-law. They'll try to get you angry, to make you seem vindictive and unreliable to the jury. Let them try," I said. "I am ready." The day I was scheduled to testify, I walked into the courtroom feeling a profound sense of calm. This was not the same woman who had sat through the probate hearings, seething in silence. I had Sarah's letter in my purse, a tangible reminder of what and who I was fighting for. Tom was already there, at the defendant's table, He had lost weight in prison. His expensive suit hung on his frame, and the charming glow he once radiated was gone, replaced by a dull, sallow complexion. He looked like a man hollowed out from the inside. When he saw me, his eyes flashed with the old hatred, but there was something else there now, fear. He was no longer the puppet master. He was just a man in a cage, about to be judged. I took the stand, swore the oath, and answered the prosecutor's questions clearly and concisely. I told the story of Sarah's marriage, of my initial misgivings, of the prenup, of the change I saw in my daughter. I recounted the discovery of the USB drive, my voice steady, betraying no emotion. When Rios played the video and the audio for the new jury, I did not watch. I closed my eyes and pictured Sarah in her studio, surrounded by light and color. Then came the cross-examination. Tom's lawyer, a man named Peters, approached me with a practiced, gentle demeanor. He was trying to present himself as a reasonable man, just trying to understand a complex situation. Mrs. Reed, he began, his voice soft. You've testified that you never liked your son-in-law. Is that correct? I did not trust him. I corrected. There is a difference. A difference you made abundantly clear from the very beginning. Isn't that right? You forced him to sign a prenuptial agreement, a document designed to keep him away from what you considered your family's money. I took a step to protect my daughter's assets, a step your client willingly agreed to. He paced before me. Isn't it true, Mrs. Reed, that your daughter Sarah suffered from anxiety? That she was in therapy for years? My daughter was a sensitive and empathetic person, I replied, my voice even. She sought counseling to develop healthy coping mechanisms for the stresses of life. It was a sign of her strength, not weakness. Or perhaps, he countered, raising his voice slightly, it was a sign of her instability? An instability that grew worse after her marriage? Isn't it true that you and your daughter argued frequently about her marriage to Mr. Gallagher? We had disagreements, as all mothers and daughters do. I was concerned for her. It turned out my concern was justified. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Let's talk about that concern. Did it ever manifest as anger? Mrs. Reed, did you ever tell your daughter that her husband was a worthless gold digger? Did you pressure her, belittle her choices, adding to her anxiety, pushing her and her husband to the breaking point? This was their game, to make me the villain, to make Sarah the unstable victim, and Tom the poor, provoked husband. But I would not play. I looked not at him, but at the jury. Mr. Peters, I said, my voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. I loved my daughter more than my own life. My only crime was underestimating the depths of your client's depravity. I worried he would break her heart. I never imagined he would stop it from beating. Peters was taken aback by my directness. He tried a different tack. Your daughter's final will, he said, holding up a copy. This foundation for victims of domestic violence. It's a noble idea. But isn't it also a rather dramatic, almost theatrical gesture? The kind of thing a person in a heightened emotional state might conceive? I felt a surge of fury, hot and sharp. He was trying to twist her greatest act of grace into a symptom of madness. I took a slow breath, remembering Rios's warning. I would not give him the satisfaction of my anger. Mr. Peters, I said, my voice now laced with ice. That will was not a gesture. It was a lifeline. It was my daughter, in her darkest hour, reaching out not for vengeance, but to help others. She was trapped in a relationship with a man who threatened her, who hurt her, and who ultimately murdered her for her money. In the face of that terror, she created a legacy of hope. To suggest that this act of profound courage and compassion is a sign of instability is not only insulting to her memory, It is a desperate, pathetic attempt to excuse the inexcusable. A dead silence fell over the courtroom. Peter stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He had tried to bait me, and I had turned his own weapon against him. He had no more questions. He mumbled, "Nothing further, Your Honor," and retreated to his table. Defeated, I stepped down from the stand, my head held high. I had spoken my truth. I had defended my daughter's honor. The rest was in the hands of the jury. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they filed back into the jury box, their faces were grim and resolved. I didn't need to hear the verdict. I could see it in their eyes. The foreman, a middle-aged man with a tired face, stood and handed the slip of paper to the clerk. The clerk passed it to the judge. The judge read it, her expression unchanging, and handed it back to the foreman. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the foreman said, his voice echoing in the silent room, "How do you find the defendant, Thomas Gallagher?" He paused, and in that split second, I saw Tom squeeze his eyes shut. "We the jury," the foreman declared, "find the defendant guilty." A wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees washed over me. It was done. It was finally, truly done. Tom didn't move. He just slumped in his chair. A broken, empty thing. The monster had been vanquished. The sentencing was 2 weeks later. The judge, citing the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the exceptional cruelty and depravity of his actions, sentenced Thomas Gallagher to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die in a cage. As he was led from the courtroom for the last time, he was no longer a man. He was a ghost, already forgotten. I walked out of the courthouse, not into a media scrum, but into the quiet embrace of a new life. David was there, as always, but this time, I wasn't just his client. I was his partner in a new venture. The first shelter for the Sarah Reed Foundation was set to open in the fall. My daughter's legacy was just beginning, and in a way, so was mine. I had walked through the deepest darkness imaginable, but I had not let it consume me. I had emerged into the light, carrying her memory not as a burden, but as a torch. She was gone, but her light would now shine for others, a beacon for those lost in the same darkness that had taken her. Justice had been served. Now, it was time for healing to begin. The first chill of autumn had returned to Boston, a year to the season since Sarah's death. But this time, the crisp air didn't feel like a harbinger of loss. Felt clean. A fresh start. Today was the grand opening of the first Sarah Reed House, a handsome brick building in a quiet part of the city, its windows bright and welcoming. It was the first physical manifestation of my daughter's last wish, a sanctuary built from the ashes of her own. The opening ceremony was a modest affair. The mayor said a few words. A handful of city council members posed for pictures, and David gave a brief, eloquent speech about Sarah's vision. I had declined to speak myself. My words had been spoken in a courtroom. This house, this place of safety, was Sarah's speech. It needed no addition from me. I stood at the back of the small crowd, watching as the first residents, a few women and their small children who had arrived the night before, listened from the doorway. Their faces were a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a fragile, flickering hope. They were the reason we were here. They were the women Sarah had died to save. After the speeches were done and the small crowd began to mingle over coffee and pastries, I slipped away from the handshakes and sympathetic glances. I wandered through the halls of the house. It was clean and bright, decorated in warm, soothing colors. It didn't feel like an institution. Felt like a home. There was a children's playroom filled with donated toys, a communal kitchen that smelled of freshly baked bread, and a small library with comfortable armchairs. Every detail, from the soft blankets on the beds to the original art on the walls, had been chosen with care, with the intention of creating not just shelter, but peace. I found myself in the small garden at the back of the house. A young woman was sitting on a bench, wrapped in a thick sweater. Though the sun was warm, she looked to be in her early 20s, with dark, wary eyes and a nervousness in the way she held herself, as if she were expecting a blow at any moment. She looked up as I approached and started to get to her feet, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "I'm sorry. Am I not supposed to be out here?" "Not at all," I said, giving her what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "It's a beautiful day. I was just getting some air. May I join you?" She nodded hesitantly, and I sat down on the other end of the bench. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the distant city sounds. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice so quiet I could barely hear it. "For what?" I asked. "For this place," she said, gesturing vaguely at the house. I don't know where I would have gone. My little boy and I. We had nowhere." "I'm glad you're safe here," I said, and the words felt inadequate. "Hello. My name is Maria," she offered. "I'm Evelyn," I replied. She looked at me, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "I know. I read about your daughter, Sarah. I'm so sorry." I nodded, my throat suddenly tight. I had expected this moment, but I was not prepared for the reality of it. To be face to face with a woman whose life was the direct result of my daughter's death. "He told me I was crazy," Maria said, her gaze dropping to her hands, which she was twisting in her lap. "My ex. He was so charming to everyone else. So smart. So successful. Everyone thought he was perfect. But at home, he would tell me I was worthless. That I was lucky he put up with me. He never hit me where the bruises would show. He was too clever for that. He broke things. He'd punch the wall right next to my head. He controlled all the money. Took my phone. He made me feel like I was the one who was wrong. That I was the one making him angry." Her story was a chilling echo of Sarah's, a different verse in the same horrifying song. "The hardest part," she continued, her voice trembling, "was feeling so alone. Like I was the only one in the world this was happening to. That no one would ever believe me over him. When I read about your daughter, what she wrote in her will, I realized I wasn't alone. It made me feel brave. Brave enough to take my son and leave." Her words struck me with the force of a physical blow. I had thought of the foundation as a memorial, a legacy, a form of justice. I had never fully understood its power as a message. Sarah's story, amplified by the trial, had reached this young woman in her own private prison and had handed her a key. "My daughter was brave, too," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "Braver than I ever knew. She saved my life," Maria said simply. She finally looked at me, her dark eyes filled with a raw, profound gratitude. "I want you to know that. Her life, it meant something. It saved me." In that moment, standing in the garden of the house named for my child, talking to a stranger who was alive because of her, the final pieces of my own shattered heart began to rearrange themselves. The purpose of all the pain, all the fighting, all the grief, became starkly, beautifully clear. Tom Gallagher was a footnote. He was a bad man who would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell, growing old and irrelevant. I rarely thought of him anymore. He had been the agent of my daughter's death, but he was not the final word in her story. This was. This house. This garden. This young woman finding the courage to start a new life. This was the final word. The rage that had fueled me for so long was gone, burned away completely. In its place was something quieter, but infinitely more powerful. It was a sense of profound, solemn purpose. Sarah had passed a torch to me, and I had to keep it burning. Not for her, but for all the Mariahs of the world. For their sons and daughters. I reached out and placed my hand on Maria's. Her skin was cold. "You are safe now," I said. "And you are not alone." For the first time, she gave me a small, watery smile. "I know," she said. "Not anymore." I left the opening ceremony shortly after that. I didn't say long goodbyes. I just slipped away, leaving the house to its new inhabitants, to its true purpose. As David drove me home, I looked out the window at the city, at the faces of the people we passed on the street. I no longer saw a world that had stolen my daughter. I saw a world that needed her, that needed the legacy of compassion she had left behind. When I got home, the house was quiet, as always, but the silence no longer felt like an absence, felt like peace. I walked into the library and stood before Sarah's portrait. Her smile, once a source of unbearable pain, now looked like a promise that good could triumph over evil, that light could find its way into the darkest of rooms. I had thought that getting justice for Sarah would be the end of my story, but I was wrong. It was the end of the chapter of grief, but a new one was beginning. A chapter of service, of building, of honoring her not by looking back at what I had lost, but by looking forward to what we could still create. I took the letter she had written me from its hiding place and read it one more time. Don't let my memory be a house full of shadows. Let it be a reason to open the windows. I looked around the library, at the late afternoon sun streaming in, illuminating her portrait. The windows were open, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt the warmth on my face. 5 years. 5 years since the gavel fell and declared my daughter's true will. 5 years since a monster was locked away in the darkness he deserved. 5 years since I had begun the second act of my own life. The Sarah Reed Foundation was no longer just a single house. It was a network. 3 houses in the greater Boston area. A 24-hour hotline. A team of pro bono lawyers who fought for restraining orders and custody battles. It had a life of its own now. A vibrant, breathing entity run by a passionate director and a team of dedicated staff, many of whom were survivors themselves. My role had shifted. I was no longer involved in the day-to-day operations. I was the matriarch, the keeper of the flame, the chair of the board. I used my name and my influence to raise funds, to lobby politicians for stronger domestic violence laws, to ensure that Sarah's legacy would outlive me. The work gave me a purpose that ran deeper than any corporate success I had ever achieved. I sold the large, empty house in Beacon Hill. It was a place of ghosts, and I had finally made my peace with them. I moved into a smaller, modern apartment overlooking the harbor, a place filled with light and art. I painted almost every day. My canvases were no longer filled with quiet landscapes, but with bold, vibrant abstracts, full of color and movement. They were the paintings of a woman who was no longer afraid of taking up space in the world. David Chun retired, but he still came over for sherry every Friday afternoon. We would talk about politics, about books, about the progress of the foundation. He was my dearest friend, constant, steady presence in a life that had been defined by so much upheaval. I never visited Tom in prison. I never once looked up his name or inquired about his life there. He was a closed chapter, a line of ink on a page I had long since turned. To think of him would be to give him a power over me he did not deserve. He had taken enough. He would not take my peace. One crisp spring morning, I received an invitation in the mail. It was for a college graduation. Maria, the young woman I had met in the garden of the first Sarah Reed house all those years ago, was graduating with a degree in social work. She had written a small note at the bottom of the card. "You and Sarah are the reason I am here. I'd be honored if you would come." The ceremony was held on a sprawling green lawn under a perfect blue sky. I found Maria in the crowd of black-robed graduates, her young son, now a bright-eyed boy of 8, holding her hand. When she saw me, her face broke into a radiant smile. It was a smile I had never seen on her before, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy and accomplishment. She introduced me to her son, Liam. He looked me straight in the eye and shook my hand firmly. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Reed," he said, with a seriousness that made me smile. "My mom says you're a hero." "Your mom is the hero, Liam," I replied, my voice catching. After the ceremony, Maria told me about her plans. She had been offered a job. She was going to be a counselor, a victim's advocate. She was going to work for the Sarah Reed Foundation. "I want to help women the way I was helped," she said, her eyes shining with purpose. "I want to be the person who tells them that they are not alone, that they will be believed. I want to give them what Sarah gave me." We were standing under a large oak tree, the dappled sunlight filtering through the new leaves. And in that moment, I saw it, the true, beautiful, and eternal nature of my daughter's legacy. It wasn't in the buildings, or the bank accounts, or even the laws we had helped to change. It was here. It was a circle. It was the compassion of one woman igniting the courage of another, who in turn would dedicate her life to igniting that same courage in others. A single act of love, rippling outwards, creating endless waves of hope and healing. Tom had tried to extinguish a light, but he had failed. All he had managed to do was shatter it into 1,000 pieces, and now each piece was its own brilliant, burning star, lighting up the darkness for others. I thought of the $1, the single, insulting dollar my daughter had left him. It had been her final, perfect judgment on his worth. But his true punishment was not the loss of a fortune. It was this. It was to be a forgotten man in a dark cell, while the woman whose life he tried to erase had her name spoken with love and reverence. It was to know that her legacy was one of creation and healing, while his was one of destruction and decay. He had sought to inherit wealth, but she had bequeathed a movement. As I drove home from the graduation, the city glowing in the late afternoon light, a profound sense of peace settled over me. It was not the absence of sadness. I would miss my daughter every day for the rest of my life. But the grief was no longer a raw, gaping wound. It had become a part of me, quiet, deep river that flowed alongside the joy, purpose, the love. I arrived at my apartment and walked out onto the balcony. The sea breeze was cool on my face. I looked out over the harbor, at the sailboats gliding across the water, their sails white against the deep blue. I had not been able to save my daughter. That was a truth I would have to carry forever. But I had saved her memory. I had honored her last wish. And in doing so, I had found a way to save myself. I thought of her final letter, of her plea to open the windows. I looked at the vast, open sky, and I took a deep breath. The air was fresh, and the world, for all its darkness, was still full of light. Sarah was gone, but in a way, she was everywhere. And I was no longer just a mother in mourning. I was a guardian of her light, and I would carry it forward, for as long as I had left.